Good afternoon, fellow patriots. This is Matt Shea, and welcome to Patriot Radio, broadcasting live from deep inside the heart of the future Liberty State. Brought to you once again by On Fire Ministries, in the legacy of Dr. Stan Monteith, bringing you the story behind the story and the news behind the news, where it's not about right or left, it's about right and wrong. It's about our hope not being in man, but in Jesus Christ. About not ending in prayer, but moving to action. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Father, deliver us from the evil one.
Welcome to Patriot Radio.
Good afternoon, fellow patriots. This is Matt Shea, and today on Patriot Radio, standoff in the South China Sea. Yes, tensions rising there. Also, the new Sultan emerges, and Ashley Biden's diary, confirmed by no less than Snopes, and also communist organizations here in the United States preparing for civil unrest. And lastly, J. Michael Waller is going to be joining us today to discuss the state of America and disinformation. Our goal here at Patriot Radio is to provide you more accurate information than the legacy media, and to prepare your family for the times ahead, indeed the times that are already upon us. No fear, we were made for this. And that brings us now to the summer of harvest. Please make sure you subscribe on Rumble, Patriot Radio US. Follow us on Telegram, Patriot Radio US. So just remember that and share this stuff with your friends and family. Again, real-time intelligence feeds on Telegram, 24/7. And then also on Rumble, you can catch up on your favorite episodes with General Flynn, Lara Logan, and more. And that brings us today to our Bible teaching, Psalms 3, verse 3. And we always have this encouragement, but I want you to hear this again. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head. I love that idea that God lifts our head up. We don't hang our heads. We lift our head up as sons and daughters in his kingdom. But also when you lift your head, you can see farther. So as Americans, let's stop hanging our head, looking at our feet, and start looking out farther what God is doing and where he's bringing us in this time. This is a time for courageous patriots, Christians, to stand. This is a time for us to put aside the distractions of this world and to put aside all of the things that have been keeping us from walking in the fullness of Jesus Christ. And to start standing, because when we start standing, it's going to embolden and encourage others to stand as well. And that brings us now to your daily intelligence briefing, coming to us from the globalist front. A surprise, potentially, or not. AstraZeneca caves and it pulls its recombinant GMO vaccines worldwide. Now, you can go back and look at the February 2020 episode of Patriot Radio. There's several of them, where we were actually talking about way ahead of time about Wuhan lab. But one of the more interesting parts of this is that we were talking too about let's call it the 19 issue. And the idea that eventually time was going to prove which side right. The question becomes, why did they pull the vaccine? And that brings us now to the China front. Coming to us from Roz Alert, the Chinese, they've been infiltrating this country for a long time, but they have specifically been trying to buy up land near key U.S. military installations. Well, the United States has just blocked a Chinese-backed crypto miner from owning land near a Wyoming nuclear missile base. Hey, we did something right. How about that? Hallelujah. How about we continue to do that going into the future, and we make sure that foreign countries aren't using our private property rights against us? Or globalists, for that matter, like maybe Bill Gates. Also, things are starting to look a bit tense in the South China Sea with the Filipino Coast Guard and elements of the Chinese maritime militia set to face off near the Sabina Shoals. Now, if we can just blow that map up just a hair, you can see that right now there are elements of both sides converging on that area. And in addition to that, there are some key diplomats that are going to be out there as well. This looks like a significant flashpoint developing. And we're going to keep our eyes on this, especially over the next 24, 48 hours. This has the potential to go very sideways very quickly. Also, for the first time, a former spy from China's notorious secret police is going public. He's a spy for one of the most feared and powerful arms of China's intelligence apparatus, and he revealed his identity as part of a Four Corners investigation. Now, that's interesting what he speaks out to. He goes by Eric, obviously not his real name. He worked as an undercover agent for a unit within China's federal police and security agency, the Ministry of Public Security, or MPS, between 2008 and early 2023. The unit is called the Political Security Protection Bureau, or the First Bureau. And it's one of the communist parties in China, key tools of repression operating across the globe to surveil, kidnap, and silence critics of the party. Now, that's very interesting. This, you'll see in communist countries, they always have a 13th department. The Soviets call it the Wet Works Department. In other words, this is the department that is specifically assigned to going after people that are critics of the regime. Now, if it was a real regime, why would they need to do that? Also, signs of the Chinese land reclamation project in the Sabina Shoal, just 75 nautical miles from Palawan Island, Philippines. Well, let me break this down for you. This artificial island would allow the Chinese significant opportunity to block the Philippines from the Spratly Islands area. So the Chinese are building strategically there to limit access to parts of the South China Sea. And then lastly, on the China front, Jeff Nyquist has a fantastic analysis of how China can choke off our military supply chain in 2023. Now, just look at this as far as the key companies listed here as choke points in the supply chain. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Canon, General Dynamics, Leonardo, and Raytheon. And then take a look at the different things that they do: data links, electronics, propulsion, software, structure, testing, and fuse and detonators. So the Chinese supply parts to these subcontractors of these companies and can easily choke off the U.S. supply chain of missiles, specifically JDAMs and Tomahawks. This is going to be I want everybody to bookmark that post. That is going to become a very critical thing when China starts this war here in the next few years or sooner. That brings us to the Middle East front. Coming to us from OSINT defender Talal Abu Zarifa, a senior member of the Palestinian Communist Terrorist Organization, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, was reportedly killed by an Israeli airstrike in central Gaza. I'm not worried so much about that, but here's what I want to highlight. A communist terror organization that's also jihadi. This is the red-green axis we've been talking about on this show for a long time. And this is the red-green axis we're now seeing in the United States of America with these Palestinian protests combined with communist organizations. This is going to continue throughout the summer. These organizations have come together to recruit, and I'm going to get to that here in a second. But remember, the communists and the jihadis have to be a coalition. And Carlos the Jackal said that that was the only coalition that would have any chance of defeating the United States. Also, the new Sultan emerges. Yes, Recep Erdogan. He turned yet another church, an Orthodox church, into a mosque in Istanbul. Why is he doing this? Because this is what the Sultan will do prior to his ordination. In addition to that, President Erdogan stated earlier today that he does not see Hamas as a terrorist organization, but instead a resistance organization against the state of Israel, with him further claiming that over 1,000 Hamas members are currently receiving medical treatment at hospitals in Turkey. No, he's just being the new Sultan. That's what he's doing. And he is claiming to be the safe area for those jihadi organizations that are striking out against Israel in the West. And that brings us now to the Russia front. A lot to cover here. The head of the Sumy region of northeastern Ukraine has ordered an immediate evacuation for the towns of Vorozboda and Bilopilya. And near the border with the Kursk region of Russia, here's what's happening just in very short order. There is another front that the Russians have opened up. This is an offensive, the significant offensive operation that people have been waiting for. And a lot of these towns on the border, people are like, oh, they took over towns on the border in Ukraine. And a lot of those towns were already evacuated and were empty. However, there is fierce fighting going on in that area right now. And once again, Russian armor is taking a pounding from anti-armor missiles. Now, this is a lesson for Taiwan about anti-ship, anti-air, and anti-armor man-portable systems that can be very, very strategically used to slow and advance. Now, yes, the Russians are advancing with 5 battalions at the last count. So we're going to keep our eyes on this as well. But it's interesting that on the economic front in this war, Russia's Gazprom is the largest losses in 25 years, according to British intelligence. Gazprom's revenues fell by about 30%, resulting in an annual net loss of $6.9 billion. So in some respects, the choking off of oil is working. It'll be interesting to see if that continues here into the near future, if the Russians have found a workaround, especially getting their oil to friendly countries like North Korea and China, which they have. But they also, the question is, are they finding workarounds to get oil to India? And the answer is yes to that as well. So we're going to keep our eyes on that part of it, because logistics is what wins wars. Also in a shakeup, former Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu, he was removed from that position, but he was appointed to the position of Secretary of the Security Council of Russia. And so some people were like, oh, he's been removed. Well, no, he was moved. But the fact is, there is a shakeup going on there, and it appears Putin is settling in for a long war. Also, last night in Tbilisi, actually the night before as well, and for weeks now, thousands of pro-EU protesters are in front of the Georgian parliament saying no to Russia and yes to the EU. They were playing the EU national anthem. Again, a flashpoint there. People don't want to be a part of Russia. And that brings us now to the national front. Fantastic analysis by Mike Shelby. The Socialist Rifle Association, now you know who they are because we've talked about them here on this show, has experienced significant growth since 2020. Now, in 2020, it was 233% membership growth in that year. But here is what we've seen with communist organizations overall here in this area, the northwest of the United States, a tenfold increase in communist organizations. And we're now seeing them deploying to universities during these protests. So you have Antifa. What they're doing is recruiting as part of these things. This isn't the main event. They're recruiting during these protests at the universities. And they are preparing, just like in 2020, they are preparing for significant unrest leading into the election and then following the election when Trump wins. So, why do I call attention to this? Because they actually, even though there's a 233% membership growth, I want you to take a look at how many in 2020. At the peak of their recruiting, Black Lives Matter movement, etc., which was way more popular, like 60 to 70% versus 10 to 20% regarding the pro-Palestine movement. But even at their peak, they only had 10,000 members. Okay? So I want you to understand that, yes, they've been growing over the years, but their actual numbers are not that big. And so for all of us as patriots and Americans, we can understand that when we show up, we're going to outnumber these guys, but we've got to show up. And another thing that needs to happen is county prosecutors and state attorneys general, should all be doing the following. Georgia's Republican Attorney General Chris Carr is using RICO statutes to indict 61 Antifa members and militant anarchists who used domestic violence to try and stop a $90 million police training facility in DeKalb County. Now, why do I bring this up? Because they always project onto you, onto me. They try to project onto us that we're the violent ones when they're actually the ones that are doing violence. So it is incumbent upon states' attorneys general and county prosecutors to start breaking up these communist and jihadi terrorist organizations here in the United States of America. And in Georgia, they're finally doing it. This is an example for the attorney general in Idaho, because those organizations are operating in all 50 states, but predominantly in key metropolitan areas like, Boise. So there's a good attorney general over there in Idaho that should be doing this. This should be an example across the board of breaking up these communist and jihadi networks. That brings us next to the alarming story of a 9-year-old girl who was attacked at school for, quote, not being Muslim, end quote. Police in the town of Savage, Minnesota are investigating an attack on a little girl at a local school by assailant school children who told officials they beat her up because, quote, she wasn't Muslim. So again, we talked about this physical violence coming this year, and now it's beginning to happen against Christians and against those who are not Muslim. So, and not communists too, on top of that. So, as Americans, again, we have the right to bear arms, and we have the right to do that in defense of ourselves and our other rights, like the right to life and liberty, the pursuit of happiness or property. We have the right to do that, to defend ourselves. And I think we're going to see more and more people leaving public schools in some of these areas, going to private Christian school, going to homeschool, because of the persecution that is occurring against Christians in this country. So there are many options, great homeschool co-ops, Kingdom Christian Academy, many other great Christian schools. But why would we want to put our children into that kind of an environment instead of training them up in the way they should go? And that brings us to Queers for Palestine block a highway. I love this. They blocked a highway in Florida, Interstate 4 exit to Walt Disney World in Orlando on Saturday. And it lasted for 11 minutes. Bravo to the Florida law enforcement that quickly dealt with that situation. And again, a model for the rest of the country. Gateway Pundit has a great article today about Michael Cohen. He admitted paying former porn star Stormy Daniels from his own pocket. Why this court case has not been thrown out yet, I don't know. Well, yes, I do know. It's because it's supposed to try to tie up President Trump from campaigning. And then even Snopes is admitting now they reversed their fact check after Ashley Biden herself confirmed her diary was real in a letter to Judge Laura Taylor Swain. Let that hang in the air for a second. Even Snopes is having to admit the truth. And as we talk about the things going on in the world right now, what can you and your family do to prepare? What can you and your family do to be ready for the times that are ahead. I want to just go through 5 key things right now. Number 1, get right with Jesus. Repent, confess your sins, come together as a family, forgive each other. But be on solid spiritual ground as a first order priority. Second, make sure you have food stored up. Now, there are many ways to do this, and it can seem overwhelming to people, but make sure that you are storing up food for at least 6 months, optimally 2 years. And there are plenty of options. Bean, wheat. Beans are fantastic. Wheat is fantastic. Stores for a long time. But just start doing it because you don't want to become a burden on other people. Number 3, make sure you have some form of water filtration. So not only are you able to have something to eat, but you have some way to get fresh, clean water. And number 4, it's very important that you have some way to communicate or to listen to communications. One of the best ways is through a single sideband radio that also has the NOAA weather channel on it as well. So a single sideband radio, you can just set it up. It's got an antenna that's about that big, and you can string that antenna up anywhere very easily and be able to catch what's actually going on out there. So even if you can't transmit, you can actually receive. But if you do need to transmit, and most of us do need to communicate, is super important. You get your ham radio license and make sure that you are getting quality ham radios that will actually work over distance. So, number 5, in the time that is ahead too, it is really important who you surround yourself with. Have you had the conversations with your friends and family, with your neighbors? Don't leave things to assumption. What would they do if Antifa begins to riot and start to go into neighborhoods and burn things down like happened in 2020? What would you do? Are your neighbors ready for that kind of thing? It's a conversation worth having, but also to surround yourself with people who are awake, of like mind, and who are not afraid. We're not afraid of these kinds of subjects because actually talking about these things and being prepared takes the fear out of these things. So I'll just leave you with those 5 things today. And once again, just remember Psalm 3:3. It is God who is our shield, and he's the one that lifts our head. And in this time, we should keep our head up as much as possible. And that is the briefing. Remember, the antidote to dependency and socialism is to be a God-fearing, self-reliant, freedom-loving American. And thank you again to every single person that has been helping us. It's been wonderful what you guys have been doing. It's the comments and sharing. Please keep doing it. We're breaking the algorithm. Share, like, comment again. And even if it's just a hey or great job or hey, I'd like to see this happen on the show, make sure you take a moment and do that. It really helps spread information. And as we talked about on the last show, it is really important that you spread the information. One of the greatest things you can do is share that information far and wide. Now, before we bring our guest on, we have just a little bit of time. I want to bring up a humorous video. At least I thought it was funny. And sometimes we kind of knock the delivery drivers, but there's some delivery drivers out there, they're kind of heroic, actually. They'll do anything in any circumstance, especially on ice, to get you your package. Go ahead and roll the clip. Now, for those of you listening on the radio, you can see this delivery driver gets out and the whole driveway is a sheet of ice. Now, the owner comes out, but he can't even make it a yard from his truck. So the delivery driver lays down, takes a little run, and scoots the package all the way across the ice, gives a thumbs up to the owner, and becomes a hero, at least for today. I love that. Now, also want to remind you, coming up, Sean Foyt is going to be here at On Fire Ministries on May 31st at 6 p.m. We're going to do a night of worship impartation. And also, we've got a special thing planned as well. You don't want to miss this. Sean Foyt here at On Fire Ministries, 6 o'clock, May 31st. I look forward to seeing you all here. And that brings us to our guest today, J. Michael Waller. He currently serves as a senior analyst for strategy at the Center for Security Policy, at J. Michael Waller on Twitter. And it is great to have you back on the show. You're doing excellent work out there right now, especially wading through everything, this morass of disinformation.
Well, it's great to be back.
Well, I want to talk to you. It caught my eye. You posted something. Probably a lot of people missed this. I don't know, but this is what caught my eye. About Ladislav Bittman and your relationship with him, and the idea that disinformation can actually be defeated and done so effectively. So I want, if you could, tell the listeners and everybody watching a little bit about who Ladislav was and kind of what his legacy is, and then we're going to move into how that applies to us today.
Ladislav Bittman was a wonderful man. He was known as Larry Martin after he defected from Soviet Czechoslovakia when the Soviets invaded his country in 1968. He was an intelligence officer and had been for the Soviet bloc previous to the invasion. But finally, when they invaded his own country, that was too much for him. So he came to America. And what he taught us about was the word disinformation and what it's all about and what it is. We hadn't heard the word before in public. And he was a disinformation practitioner for the Czechoslovak Secret Service, which was a subsidiary of the Soviet KGB. And he manufactured disinformation to plant in the West, to sow divisions. He was working mainly against Germany. And he also showed us how it can be defeated. And it's really not that hard to do.
Let's talk a little bit about, I was triggered by your, by the article here. It just really hit home because I dealt with it in the political realm so often. What is disinformation compared to misinformation, malinformation, these other words that have been kind of invented in the last 5 years?
Right. Invented is the exact way to put it. So disinformation is a KGB term. It's the English translation of the Russian word dezinformatia, which means deliberately distorted or fabricated information designed purposely to deceive. It's what intelligence services do. It's like lying, but at the state level. And so it's easy to remember. D is deliberate, and misinformation is mistaken. So misinformation is just, you made a mistake. You misinterpreted something. It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't malicious. But there's been such an abuse of the term by people who were actually denouncing Ladislav Bittman, years ago when he was teaching at Boston University. He was teaching journalism students how to detect and how to combat disinformation when they were reporting in the liberal press, the Boston Globe, because he was based at Boston University, the Washington Post, and New York Times didn't take him seriously or even attacked him for brainwashing students, because he was saying, just be alert for Kremlin disinformation and you'll be a good reporter. So later on, it became a politicized term. And once something is politicized, then it's not useful anymore. So disinformation as an intelligence term lost its meaning, and it became just whatever somebody didn't like. And that's not disinformation. So then people started fighting back and saying, well, it's not disinformation, or there might have been a mistake or just a misinterpretation of something or a different opinion. So then they came up with misinformation, which, and then malinformation was just made up out of whole cloth. It means bad information. It means really information that you disagree with. And what you see happening is the people who are really using the term outside of intelligence parlance to see what the Chinese or the Soviets or somebody else is doing to us, the Russians, they're post-truth people. This is part of the postmodern, post-Christian era. They don't say true or false anymore. They say disinformation and, whatever else. So they don't even say lies anymore. They don't even say, untruths. It's all disinformation. And so you have an increased use of the term. At the same time, the moral distinction between lies and truth has been wiped away.
So, the Soviet strategists kind of had these two, and again, very oversimplified, but two kind of main streams. They had one stream that was really focused on deception, and the other stream was focused on building strength and force. And the deception side seems to be failing as of late because of the spread of true information across the internet. And it seems like there is something there that we can glean, that we can learn as an antidote to disinformation out there. So I'd like you to get into a little bit of that and what Ladislav taught as part of his trademark course, Disinformation in the Press.
Yeah, if you look at what the people screaming most loudly about disinformation are doing, their solution is to censor. Their solution is to repress, to make people disappear, essentially, from the media or from social media. They're doing really what the Soviets would have done and did do by simply making people disappear. They're not trying to fight for facts and for truth. They're fighting for narrative. So anything against their narrative is a lie. And it's more than a lie, because disinformation must mean it's coming from some foreign evil source. So where they got caught up is where they couldn't censor us the way they did. They were able to censor us on social media, where we saw from the FBI, Twitter. But when Elon Musk bought Twitter and made it a real free speech area, and then exposed all the internal documentation that he had bought, all these electronic documents, and then exposed the coordination between the FBI and other services and other parts of the U.S. government with the Twitter executives, and by extension, Facebook and Instagram and everything else, you see this pattern where they're really out to censor us. It's not just conservatives whining about it. It's really happening. And here's the documentation, and here are the names of the people who did it. So we really owe a lot to Elon Musk to opening up this thing where people cannot be censored anymore.
So I found it very interesting that today happened to be the day that Snopes reversed its fact check on Ashley Biden's diary and finally said, yeah, that actually was true. But how many years later, right? I mean, everybody knew there was truth to this at the beginning, but it was trying to censor it to affect the outcome of an election. And I think they've been fairly clear that was their intent. That's not hyperbole.
Right. Imagine that if some group like Snopes, which we all know is biased, but we now know that it's recklessly biased and maybe deliberately deceptive, in order to shut down truths, to censor by falsely branding that something is false. So they're using disinformation to bolster their accusations of other people's disinformation, which actually happens to be truth. So you have this wilderness of mirrors now, where for the average person, it's extremely confusing and discouraging and demoralizing. But a group like Snopes years later had to back down. It really doesn't matter that they backed down and apologized, or did they apologize or just admit it?
No, they just changed it. Yeah.
Yeah, because they would have censored us anyway. And they did censor people, or others used the Snopes lie, fabrication, to censor people and to get people knocked off social media, and maybe get journalists to lose their jobs or get put in a painful situation in one way or another. So all these little things are coming out, and we're seeing now this new gaming effort, like a war game effort, being done. It was done 4 years ago out of Georgetown University Law School, and now it's being done again under another official sponsorship. And it is to plan using senior former government lawyers from the Pentagon, from the Justice Department, from other government agencies, at prestigious law schools like Georgetown Law Center, to game out a way to use the law in a technocratic way to censor people and to shut them up, so that if Donald Trump is elected, which they're presuming that he will be, they're not even presuming that he's going to cheat, right? So part of that is to censor people yet again. So this is the only tool they have, is lying about people by calling them liars or calling their word disinformation and then censoring them.
So how can we spot disinformation? Because a lot of people, oh, well, I just want to make sure I go to the right source, but still, even then, mistakes are made. How can we spot disinformation? What are some of the practical things that people can do, just regular Americans that can arm themselves with to spot this stuff ahead of time?
It can be very difficult. That's why it's the FBI's job under the law to be fighting against this. But do they do a good job? No. Do they have real experts? Not anymore, because I knew them and they're gone. So how does the average person do it? Really, a lot of it's just trusting your gut. If you read it in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Associated Press, you can pretty much presume that it might be a little bit different. But the thing is also, on the conservative side, a lot of conservative writers are really careless.
They are. I've seen
some of them really reckless, and it hurts all of us. So they draw out, conspiracy theories. Now that's another term where something's a conspiracy theory. It's obviously disinformation, but actually, there is such thing as a conspiracy. And if you have a theory about how it works, then it's a conspiracy theory. It's not necessarily bad. The bad part of it is when you're reckless or really ignorant about it, and you make 2 + 2 = 5, just like Orwell had done in The Ministry of Truth in his novel 1984. So the average person, you can just feel it in your gut. Stay away from, or no, you don't even stay away from the liberal media. Just know how to read it. Like you can read your teenager. You can kind of tell when they're lying, and even if you can't, you kind of know how to spin that a little bit to figure out what might not be true. So if you can tell in your human interactions, for the most part, when somebody's not being truthful with you, somebody's trying to pull the wool over your eyes or not telling the whole truth, apply that to your media diet as well, and get a good range of sources. You don't have to have a ton of them, but have a good range of them. So read. You can't escape the Associated Press. You can't escape Reuters because they're in every news outlet. But try to be, try to get some variety in your news intake, and don't just believe everything just because it's conservative either, because a lot of it's junk.
So really, the thing that we're facing right now, 5th generation warfare, this idea, this battle of ideas and narratives, and most Americans are like, well, what can I do? I mean, how could I possibly change the outcome here? What could I possibly do in little old Spokane, Washington, or wherever? What can I do to combat this? And I think that a lot of people just get overwhelmed and they just don't do anything. And that's not good either, sitting on the sideline. Right. In fact, I think there was a psychological operation during the 2020 election to get people to sit on the sideline. And I think it was called QAnon. So my thought is there's got to be something simple that people can do to combat disinformation, but more importantly, to just get the truth amplified and out there.
Oh, again, it's hard, but first of all, before talking about how difficult it can be and need not be, what the other side wants is for all of us to feel discouraged, and to feel isolated, and to feel hopeless, and to feel alone, and to demoralize us, so that we just not only sit out the elections, we sit out any kind of complaining against whatever's bad, and we sit out from even trying to correct things. So we have to understand that. A good way to understand when we see disinformation is when someone labels something as disinformation. What Ladislav Bittman taught us as a former Soviet bloc intelligence officer, and what American intelligence officers of the old school agreed with, the ones who trained me, was that you use the term very judiciously, and you never use it to apply to American politics or anything of a divisive political issue, because that's when people stop agreeing on what disinformation is. So you can point out, this is what the Russians are saying, this is what the Iranians are saying, this is what the Chinese communists are saying. That's okay, but if you say Congressman so-and-so is spouting disinformation, you're politicizing it. So when you hear someone using the term in domestic politics, I would just disregard it. Even though a lot of times it's going to be true. You have members of Congress who are repeating Russian and Chinese disinformation themes. But to you're going to make it a partisan issue. You can say, here are some of the Russian and Chinese communist disinformation themes, and then map them out. That's fine. Let other people draw their own conclusions then. Each one of us can draw our own conclusions. Which politicians, which business figures, which media figures are echoing that?
So the question for some people is they're going to be really interested in this. They're going to be passionate about this. And there was a course, an actual course on this that was taught. I know you have access to that. Are you going to make that available to the public, or is that going to be available at least to some people maybe that you think would benefit from it? I mean, how is that going to work?
Yeah, so that was a course that I took in 1987. When I was a graduate student, I studied under Ladislav Bittman for my master's degree and again for my PhD. So I had him and studied closely under him for several years, as well as other people of his grit, of his quality. They really knew what doing because they had been doing it against the United States for so many years. So you learn from the best. Then they became loyal Americans, and we ended up relying on them a great deal. So I rediscovered my course notes from 1987 and all of the handouts and all the messages and other things that Ladislav Bittman had provided. That stuff doesn't exist at all online. So I decided I'm going to reproduce the whole course. Since he's passed away, I'm reproducing it on Big Intel at Substack. So my book, Big Intel, is about the CIA and the FBI and how they went woke. Substack relates to the book, but it's anything unusual about intelligence and counterintelligence and that whole world. So I'm putting it up there on Substack, and so it's up there for the whole world to see. Some of it's behind a paywall, but you at least get to see some of the free parts to understand what's happened.
Well, I think at least for some of us, it's worth the money to really dig into the people that practice this stuff so that we aren't going to be caught unawares in the time that we're in, especially 2024. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your book, Big Intel. It was, at least last time I saw it, doing very well on Amazon. And that's really good to see. What is it about, and what were you trying to expose? What was kind of the intent or your heart behind this?
The intent on writing the book was to explain how the FBI and the CIA went from these institutions where we can criticize things that they did over the years, but how they went from basically defending our country from Cold War heroes to deep state villains. That's the subtitle of the book. Mm. How did it happen and why? So I was looking at it under Obama, Trump, and Biden. And in doing the research, I found that, I had seen it. I'd seen things take place earlier since the 1980s, really. But it was not this wokeness and this anti-Americanism that these agencies have embraced. Imagine they're entrusted with protecting our constitutional order, and they don't believe in our constitutional principles anymore. So how did it happen? And it turns out it wasn't just, Obama came in and made it that way. I knew that wasn't the case, but I couldn't prove it. So I set out to try to prove it. And indeed, I was able to do so, going back to a meeting more than 100 years ago. This has been a 100-year campaign, first waged by the Russians against us and their communist, instruments, different communist parties and agents around the world. And over 100 years, they were able to penetrate our institutions from our, as we know, universities. In fact, the Soviet campaign transferred from Germany to Columbia University back in the 1930s. So to see what's happening at Columbia today should be no surprise.
No surprise at all.
And it was to infiltrate our institutions, infiltrate our churches. Think of the different churches out there that are always bashing America, that are always embracing all this crazy stuff that is anti-Christian, unchristian at best, and all this is weird stuff. But if you look back at a lot of those different churches, you'll see they were promoting Soviet propaganda campaigns in conjunction with the Soviets, going back a lifetime, more than a lifetime.
I think that might be a little bit overwhelming to people. As I was studying it, I saw there was over 329 confirmed Soviet agents inside the Roosevelt administration, really kind of the start of everything. The Venona transcripts and the Matroikin archives all confirming these things, that Joseph McCarthy was actually probably onto something. And he had access to the Venona transcripts. So I think it's important for people to understand the scope of this. When you say institutions, it sounds like you're alluding to Antonio Gramsci's march through media and through churches and through the universities, and we're seeing really the culmination of that.
Yeah, entertainment and journalism and arts and culture and governments, you name it, anything that influences, they marched through those institutions and took them over. And churches were a big target.
Yeah, churches.
So think of Columbia University. That had the nation's premier teachers college. That's one of the reasons Columbia University was targeted, so that they could infiltrate the teachers college to teach the teachers. And they were doing this with a labor union in the 1930s. And the head of the labor union, who went to Stalin's Soviet Union and wrote a series of 6 articles in the New Republic praising Stalin's education system and saying, we need that in America. And that was the president of the National Education Association.
All those years ago. And talk a little bit about the red-green axis that we're seeing now on the college campuses as well, because you don't just see the Palestinian flag up there. You look carefully off to the fringes, you can see Communist Party USA signs, RevCom, and some other things like that on these fringes. I think a lot of people dismiss that, but it's actually very critical to understand so that we get a full picture of what's happening right now in 2024.
Yeah, it's vital to understand. And this is the strange thing. Decades earlier, say during the Cold War, you had the similar coalitions. But the communists, anything to do with Marxism and communism, they kept in the background on purpose. They didn't want their presence to be seen because it would discredit the message and discredit the effectiveness of the movement. Now it's gotten to such a point where the university have become so extreme, and the faculty has become so extreme, and the foundations funding it are larger and more influential than ever, that these hardcore communist groups come out of the closet and they're right there. And what is the typical response? As you just said, let's brush that aside. So you have this coalition, red-green axis. Red is the communists, green is radical Islam, and they're working together. They're working together not so much because they like each other, but because they have a common enemy. And that's people like you and me. And it's our system of government that is their main target. And when they say death to America, they really mean it. It's not just some, drunken fraternity slogan. They really mean death to America. So they want to wipe us out. The radical Muslims do, and the communists do. So it's a natural alliance of convenience for them.
Well, Carlos the Jackal said it would be the coalition of Islamists and Marxists that would try to overwhelm the West, or what had the best shot of doing it. I don't think they're going to succeed, which kind of brings me to the final topic I want to talk about with you, and that is just what happens over the next 8 months or just the next 6 months. We see these protests on the university campuses, and it looked like a warm-up, like they were just using them as recruiting drives. I mean, what is your take on this?
That's part of it, and they're great recruiting drives because this is where you get college kids who really don't know what they're doing. They've got some grievance, or they've got some do-gooder mentality, and they see the human costs of war, as every war has terrible human costs, but they blame it all on their own government and on the Israelis, and they give Hamas, which started this, right? They give them a free pass. And so their anger is genuine, their frustrations are genuine, and it's a radicalizing experience for them. And I understand what it's like, because when I was in high school, I got involved in that kind of stupid stuff too, because I was a do-gooder and ended up being a communist dupe. And then they went and they started training me. And then finally they let slip that it was an environmental movement that I was in. They let slip, this isn't about the environment. This is about overthrowing American capitalism. I was horrified by that. But these people in the movement today are not horrified by it at all. They want to do this. And you see so many parents are being so permissive about it. And so many universities, until very recently, the past few weeks, are being permissive about it. So that's a wonderful recruitment ground for them, because they're going through something that's new, it's adventurous. These kind of riots and protests can be fun. Even when you get hurt, it's a traumatic experience, a shared traumatic experience that will last all their lives, and they can either break with it or they can go forward with it. So the ones who, very few break with it. Most of them will go forward with it all their lives.
How many, what is a percentage of these folks as compared to the rest of the U.S. population? Because the projection out there on mainstream media, this is like they try to project it as a popular movement, all of these things, but it never really seems to be when you're dealing with communists and jihadis. So what would you put the percentage at of people that actually are involved in this? And are there really awake enough Americans to fight back against this stuff and prosecutors that are willing to prosecute this stuff and break these networks up?
Yeah. The percentage is very tiny. First, they started at elite universities. Harvard. How representative is Harvard of America? Then Columbia University. So it started in these Ivy League elite woke schools. That's nowhere near mainstream America. And even when it went to places like UNC Chapel Hill, where they just had the graduation where Seinfeld was the speaker, and you had, 5%, 10% of the graduating students walked out. Okay, so that means 90 to 95% didn't walk out. So it's just a tiny minority of people who support this stuff.
Well, and then, as far as America is concerned, I'm encouraged as more people are waking up. It seems like this information is getting out. It's getting spread quickly, but it also seems like we're on this course right now to civil unrest coming up before the election, or maybe even after the election when Trump wins, and that they're planning for that stuff right now. How are you analyzing that?
Well, 4 years ago, it was the BLM riots. So these riots have sort of a 4-year distance between them. Isn't that funny? It's only on election years that these big riots happen, election season. So last time it was BLM and all the craziness that went with that. And that was the first recruitment of the newest crop of people. And it got in a lot of people from the mainstream who would never even imagine being involved, but they saw, racial issues because everything was racist, right? We had to fight no matter what. So it was all this virtue signaling on racism, and people genuinely outraged at what they saw as police brutality, even though the policeman was not convicted of what he was accused of. So you had that, but back then in 2020, they were all supporting Joe Biden's candidacy. Mm-hmm. You even had Angela Davis, that old Communist Party operative, going back to the late 60s, early 70s, as a hardcore communist operative working with the Cuban regime and the East German Stasi and the Soviets. And she ran twice as a Communist Party candidate for vice president of the United States. So all the other radical Marxist-Leninist parties would run their own protest candidates to peel off a few thousand votes just to show that they've got some support. But in 2020, Angela Davis came out and said, we're not running opposition candidates this year. We're just going to hold our nose and vote for Joe Biden because we're going to get more out of him than we will out of anybody else. That was really telling because it was obvious that the Biden campaign would need every last vote, every last radical, every last community organizer to bring in all these votes. And a lot of them are Marxist groups that are doing this organizing. So the fact that Angela Davis, she went on Russian TV, she went on Putin's RT TV channel to announce this. And none of the communist parties ran their protest candidates that year. But now it's very different. Now they're against Joe Biden. They want to radicalize the Democrat Party even further, which they have, calling him Genocide Joe. They're not attacking Trump. They're not attacking Trump supporters. And this is really remarkable. They're trying to push the party further and further left, to the extreme left, to the point now where you have Hamas Democrats. And Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, who says he's the most highest ranking Jew ever elected in the United States, you don't hear him coming out very strong against these groups. You don't hear him asking Attorney General Merrick Garland to sic the FBI on these groups and to take them down. Instead, what is he doing? He's supporting Biden's radical team to put an arms embargo on Israel as it's up against Iran and it's trying to take down Hamas. How much more extreme can you get when the president of the United States is doing things to benefit a terrorist organization that has been designated a terrorist group since Bill Clinton first designated it in 1997.
Yeah.
So they're looking to polarize our country even further.
So it would appear they think Trump is actually going to win this time, but they don't care because something's coming after Trump and something is in the offing right now. And it seems like we're headed toward war worldwide. And so again, we're in this place of we don't know what's going to happen, but as Americans, we can always prepare. We can always get information out that is true. Well, my last question is this regarding county prosecutors. If the DOJ is not going to do it, FBI is not going to do it, Big Intel is not going to do it, do we have a shot at county prosecutors or even state AGs being able to do this?
Sure, and you're seeing that happen now in states like Louisiana, especially Louisiana. They've passed a lot of bills this legislative season, this spring. In fact, they passed one today to really crack down and to use state civil rights laws, which didn't exist a generation ago,
wow,
and use those laws to enforce any attacks on people based on their ethnicity and religious background and so forth. And in Louisiana, a school like Tulane, which is a heavily Jewish school with a lot of Hamas activity going on there, now the state of Louisiana is going to go after these extremists to defend these students. So you have it going on along Florida, Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, a whole bunch of states. And you have even the state of Missouri suing the Biden administration in a case right now before the Supreme Court. So you'll see that more and more states are taking action. And in fact, the New Hampshire governor's race, Kelly Ayotte, who's a Republican, she's a former U.S. senator from New Hampshire. She's running for governor, and her slogan is "Don't mass up New Hampshire." Don't make New Hampshire like Massachusetts. So you're seeing a resistance from the liberal Northeast, tiny state, all the way to the big states in the Midwest and elsewhere in the country. So this is where the state AGs are going to become increasingly more important because there's always been a deference to defer to federal authorities. Now they're saying we can't defer to these people anymore. We're going to assert the rights we have under our federalist Republican system of government and tell the central government to take a hike.
So big intel to state intel. J. Michael Waller, thank you so much for joining me on Patriot Radio today. God bless you and keep up the fight.
God bless you too. It's great to be with you again.
J. Michael Waller, you can find him at bigintel.substack.com and at J. Michael Waller on Twitter. Follow page is fantastic. Check it out on Substack. And if you haven't yet, make sure you get the book. This is Matt Shea. Thank you for joining me today on Patriot Radio. May God bless all of you. He is making this generation the greatest one. The awakening is here. Keep up the fight.